I think it's exciting. And I think what we tend to forget is, all of these commandments that God gave are all about freedom. They're all about freedom. That is God's highest ideal is freedom. I mean, look at Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, right? You are free to eat anything. There's only one thing you can't do, right? And that the restriction on the one thing actually demanded that they have free will. Okay, without that, they really wouldn't have had free will. You can eat anything you want, go for it. But there's one thing you can't do. Now you have to actually exercise your free will. And I think we forget that God is all about free will. And it's a collaboration with God, right? He created the dirt, right? Now you get to play in the sandbox, right? You get to do really all kinds of things, and you're free to do anything you want. You really are, but not everything is going to have a good outcome. All right. I mean, if you want to eat from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, okay, you're free to do it. I don't recommend it, but God, it's all about freedom. And so God has then given us his instructions on things that will lead to life, joy, peace, happiness, prosperity, etc. And we're then free to choose to follow them or not. And, I was thinking about, actually, I was having a conversation with a fellow pastor back around 2008 or 9. We were talking about the economic collapse, and he pointed out to me, he said, if we were to follow what God prescribed for us economically, that you release the debts, you have the Shemitah every 7 years, we would not have these boom and bust cycles where people lose their shirt, because it would already be factored in. It would be built into our very economy. We wouldn't have this wild speculation. And I thought, it was really a new concept to me. I'm like, wow, that's really amazing. I hadn't thought about that. But then I started to look at all these different things, and all of these things are all about, as you said, kind of back to square one. It's an equalization. It's so that nobody can really take advantage of one person or another. And eventually it all goes back, and we all are back on that same playing field. So we don't have this gigantic disparity between the haves and the have-nots. I mean, and so, Gidon, I like kind of to kind of press into this question about the Torah,
Yes.
because I really feel that Christianity in general has a very big chip on their shoulder. Again, when we have this basic core belief, at least some Christians, maybe not all of them, but the ones that I have hung out with a lot, have had this idea that when he died, he took the Torah and he nailed it to the cross. I've heard that in sermons, and it was like fingernails on a chalkboard, if people remember what chalkboards are.
Mhm.
But I know way back in the day, right? But it's just that nasty sound. I'm like, ooh, that doesn't sound right. But that is a very, very typical popular theology, that he came to free us from the Torah, that is those commandments that God gave back at Sinai. So that's a very major split, and it's going to be hard to even go, to date if we have that much disparity between us. And so I would really appreciate if you could bring us up to speed. What is the Torah? Why is it important? Why should Christians not be afraid of this? In fact, why might they even want to embrace this to some extent?
Well, earlier in this program, you told me, you mentioned how Jesus was there at the giving of the Torah. You alluded, or even said very clearly, about the triune Godhead. Usually, my correspondents, the people that I dialogue with, Christians, they don't talk so much about the divinity of Christ. I don't challenge them on it. Don't ask for it. Don't tell. But what people often do describe Jesus as, I guess, perhaps his human tour here on this earth. Again, I'm barely a theologian, and certainly not a Christian theologian, but Jesus, Yeshua, was a Jew. Read the New Testament, which is, I sometimes call it the life and times of Jesus Christ. It's a story of a Jewish person in a Jewish state dealing with other Jews. It's all a Jewish story. So if you're really interested in knowing that man, then you want to learn as much as you can about him. And the only way to do that is learn the Old Testament, because when Jesus talked about the Bible, I can assure you he wasn't talking about not Galatians and not Revelation and not the Gospels. He was talking about the Old Testament, which we call the Tanakh, which is the Jewish Bible. In this day and age, if there ever were any Jewish sages or Jewish people throughout the thousands of years of animosity between Jews and Christians who said, keep that a secret, it's ours, that's passé completely, if it ever exists. I'm not even sure. There are some things that there are traditions like that. But today, ever since Gutenberg, not to mention the internet, it's all out there. It is clearly out. The Jewish people consider the Bible our inheritance. It is the story of the Jewish people. But if it is the story of the Jewish people, then it is the story of Jesus's people. So you're going to want to read it to try to figure him out. And that is, I think, the reason why many of our root source students come to us. I don't ask anybody, what are you doing here? I'm not, they came to learn. They love it. Many of them volunteer and say, now I understand this aspect of Jesus's life. You're able, if you understand, if you have nothing, if you don't know nothing about Jesus except for some 10 verses that somebody told you this is what you got to know about Jesus, then you know nothing about Jesus. If you learn all about Jesus's life, then you're probably going to love him more.
So could you spell out for us just a couple, maybe one or two of those, light bulb moments, or those big things that Christians suddenly discover? They're like, oh my goodness, this helps me understand the person of Jesus so much better.
I think, just off the top of my head, I think that the fact that Hanukkah, for example, it's winter around here. The December holidays of the United States, besides Kwanzaa, are Christmas and Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the Jewish holiday, and I think that most of your viewers are familiar with it. But for those of them who might not know much more than it's the Jewish Christmas, Hanukkah means dedication, and it is a celebration of the rededication of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, in the time of the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, which was about 200 years before the Common Era. And that was a holiday that was celebrated in Jesus' time. And it specifically says, I have it here somewhere, but the verse says, and it was at the dedication.
John 10:22.
So there you go. So if you read that in English, I hope that all of your viewers know that the Bible wasn't originally written in English, either Bible.
My viewers are very smart. They're savvy. Yeah, they know
that. Hey, Jesus observed Hanukkah, and the fact that there was an argument about whether picking up a corn husk, or I don't know what it was permitted or not. That's a big story that I hear a lot of people referring to. Well, that means that Jesus followed that he observed the Shabbat. So what is this Shabbat that he observed? Again, I don't know how many stories there are in the New Testament about Jesus and Shabbat, but this idea of plucking, what's the, it better than
he was plucking grain. Yeah, he was plucking grain.
He was plucking grain. So plucking grain is something that you shouldn't do on Shabbat. You should prepare your meals before Shabbat so that you can enjoy Shabbat in general. Again, if you are about to die from hunger, then most of the 613 commandments are put on pause so that you can live by them and not die by them. But that idea of plucking grain is just one of 39 categories of prohibitions on Shabbat. I only have a couple of seconds left, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but one can assume that these were well known in Jesus' time about how one should observe the Shabbat, and he grew up in a Sabbath observant house, of course. He was a Jewish person. So I want to learn about all of these 39 categories of prohibitions that I say we should follow, but I would suggest that Christians, I want to know what the Jews did and still do to this day. It's a miracle that this tradition continued until this day and is having a renaissance as well. So those you asked me for two examples. So those are two examples that I think that those are reasons for Christians to want to learn more about Judaism.
Well, and I think, what it does is it helps people to understand that Jesus was not against Sabbath. As you said, he was observing Sabbath. As I understand it, he was challenging some of the oral tradition, not all of it, mind you, but some of it. He was challenging the oral tradition and suggesting that some of the practices that the Pharisees and Sadducees, but by and large the Pharisees, because they were the ones actually taking the Bible seriously, but some of those practices that they were observing maybe had gone beyond what God had said to do. And so again, he was challenging some, he was endorsing others. And I think just one more thing is that I think a lot of times Christians don't understand is that there were a lot of different flavors of Jews, just as there are today, right? But back then, a lot of different Pharisees, right? There's 7 different kinds of Pharisees, and sometimes Jesus has nothing but praise for them, and sometimes he's like against them, right? And I think that is the context that is completely left out. If you only read the New Testament, then it's really hard to see that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Again, only in the last 100 years have biblical studies and the fascinating phenomenon of Jews and even Orthodox Jews studying the New Testament, studying the life and times of Jesus, figuring out what happened over there. Again, from my perspective, I think they're one of the most well-known, at least to me, scholars of Jesus. Was a professor by the name of David Flusser, who wrote a book called Jesus. And I think that, again, I didn't read it, but I read about it and I read parts of it. And I think that it is phenomenal that this is, that the idea of just coming to church for an hour or two on Sunday morning and listening to a sermon, you don't have to restrict yourselves to that anymore. Go and learn about Jesus. Go and learn about what he meant, what were his ideas, and it's just an amazing. Again, we don't teach this on Root Source. We don't teach about Jesus on Root Source. We teach about the things that Jesus was teaching about. But I highly recommend that people don't wait. Just don't watch TV. Again, you were talking to your viewers. We're preaching to the choir, as they say.
Exactly, and just to let you know that my viewers are very in favor of this. They're really enjoying this.